For nearly 16 years, this plant has operated under a licence from the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. For years they had no big issue with it, but locals told us they have serious concerns.
We'd have the windows open perhaps, and then we get the smell in the house and we'd run around closing all the windows.
In response to complaints about odours locally down the years, the EPA said they couldn't be sure of the source until last summer. A legal process started, and on the last Friday before Christmas, in Portlaoise District Court, the EPA prosecuted the operators of the plant, a company called Enva. The EPA's lawyer described how locals experienced, quote, unbearable, oily and gassy odours affecting their eyes, mouth, throat and lips.
If you have a nice day out there, we can't go out our back because you feel like you're doing something bad to your child by having him out in that smell.
The company pleaded guilty to breaching their licence over several months in the latter half of 2015. So is the issue limited to that period, and is it more serious than simply odour? The EPA view now is that this problem is an odour problem, not an air quality problem. Not everyone agrees.
We have, since September 2014, we've been monitoring the air around this facility. It complies with EU, national and guideline values for the protection of public health.
This is a public health issue. It's not an odour issue. The company Enva and the EPA still have a lot of explaining to do and a lot of questions to answer.
Enva told us they have played a key role in preventing waste oil from polluting the environment. Enva is committed to applying the highest possible standards to the operation of its Portlaoise facility. So what is in the air in parts of Portlaoise and how might that affect people? And what does the EPA understand about emissions from this hazardous waste plant? Enva is Ireland's largest hazardous waste treatment company, and their plant in Portlaoise is one of their biggest hazardous waste plants. They take in waste oil used in cars and ships, which they recycle. That recycling process involves heating batches of used oil in huge tanks over several hours, up to temperatures of 102 degrees. Each tank is heated about once or twice a week. The problem is, it seems that can cause some serious odour issues. It's 9 o'clock on a Monday evening, and certainly downwind there's a strong smell, an oily smell, not unlike a garage forecourt. We're going to give the EPA a call and let them know. The EPA is responsible for regulating and licensing environmental emissions. They have a 24-hour number on their website for complaints. We gave it a call. Hi, I'm in Portlaoise and I want to make an odour complaint. Since lodging that complaint in August, we've yet to receive a response. That same night, we called into some local people to see how bad the smell was that night compared to others.
It's nothing compared to what we get here at times. During July now, we couldn't open our windows. The smell was that strong.
Sean isn't alone. When we visited the area over several months, various local residents said they experienced a similar oily, gassy smell.
I used to think it was the gas, but then it was too regular to be the gas all the time, and obviously I've had the gas checked and that.
Oh, could last all evening. I just feel sick. I don't get sick, but I feel sick. It's all here. Just all here, this awful, awful thing in my throat. That's where it catches me.
We're worried. We don't know what's in this smell. You know, the smell is bad. Now, sometimes it's worse than others, you know. Sometimes it is worse than others. But when it's bad, God, it's bad.
So how does the plant operate? Waste oil is collected from garages and ports and other locations around the country. It's brought to Portlaoise. There, it's put in large tanks where it's allowed to settle. The water that separates from the oil is drained off, but a certain amount remains. To remove remaining water, batches are pumped on to one of 4 heated tanks on site. According to several documents on file with the EPA, the mixture is typically heated to more than 80 degrees Celsius. Steam is pumped into the mixture to aid this process. Last year, Enva processed 20,000 tonnes of waste oil at the plant. The problem is, when you heat these mixtures, it won't be simply water that evaporates.
Undoubtedly, if you heat a waste oil, you are going to get some chemical molecules that are going to be emitted into the gas phase and then taken up the stack and then released into the atmosphere.
These chemicals are called hydrocarbons.
They evaporate at a relatively low temperature and certainly low relative to water. So if you're trying to remove water from the oil by heating it up, you necessarily have to envisage that some of the oil is also going to evaporate at the same time.
The fact some hydrocarbons evaporate at low temperatures is important. It means if you want to test for the maximum rate of emissions from the tanks, you need to make sure you do it when the tank is at the typical operating temperature. It's like if you were trying to test for the maximum amount of steam from a kettle. There'd be little point in testing at 30 degrees. At 50 degrees, you might detect some steam, but as it nears the boiling point, the rate of steam will be multiple times the rate that comes out at lower temperatures. It's at that point in the cycle when you'll get the most representative results.
Any measurement that is taken at room temperature or below 50 degrees is not going to be representative of the emissions that are given off under the standard operating conditions of 85 or 90 degrees.
Some of these hydrocarbons can have significant effects if ingested at high rates.
Benzene, for instance, which is emitted from the process, is a known human carcinogen. That means it's a cancer-causing compound, and it's heavily regulated all across the developed world.
Back in 1999, the EPA was interested in the rate of emissions coming from those tanks when they're heated. At that time, they were considering a licence application for the plant. As part of the licence application, the company submitted tens of documents to the EPA. When you search through the documents for details of air emissions from the plant, you'll find these too. They've never previously been reported on. They detail how 5 samples were taken of emissions from heated tanks. The temperature is listed for each sample. Of the 5 tanks, 3 were on tanks at 25 degrees or less, far below the typical operating temperature of 80 degrees or so. Of the remaining 2 samples, 1 was disregarded due to an error. The 1 remaining sample measured the emissions at 85 degrees, but over 18 minutes instead of the standard 30 minutes. These are the 5 samples on which the EPA considered the licence application. That data is at temperatures that aren't representative of a typical tank operation.
What I'm saying to you is we have since September 2014, we've been monitoring the air around this facility. It complies with EU, national and guideline values for the protection of public health.
In a statement, Enva said, "The emissions monitoring conducted as part of the licence application was carried out by third-party consultants and was subsequently repeated by the EPA. Both are considered to be consistent with the tank's normal operation." The consultancy which was commissioned no longer exists. A report analysing the impacts of the emissions from those samples was drawn up. It said the total amount of hydrocarbons emitted would reach 80% of the applicable emission limit. These reports typically have a 20% margin of error. Having received these reports, the EPA granted a licence in early 2000. It's worth noting that emission limits are not the same as air quality standards. Emission limits are used to cap the rate of emissions from specific sources. Typically, air quality standards relate to geographical areas.
We moved in '96, and it was, for a while, for years after that, it was bad. Because it's going on for years, you know. It just didn't happen overnight.
From our point of view, must have changed in the latter half of 2015, and it resulted in unacceptable odours. We took a prosecution.
So it must have changed. Do you know it changed? Or is there any evidence to show it?
Well, there is, because there was odour nuisance off-site. We were contacted by residents in the area. We verified those odour complaints.
We asked Enva if anything changed in how they managed oils through the heated tanks in mid-2015, or did they take in any new types of oil. They said, no, there was no change to either the process or the types of oils processed. In their licences, the EPA can set a cap on rates of emissions if they wish. They can also require licence holders to submit regular reports detailing emission rates. The licence they granted in 2000 on this facility included no such limits, monitoring or reporting requirements on the heated tanks.
Normally we expect licences to control emissions from an industrial process that may be harmful to the environment. And it's surprising that the licence doesn't make any reference to that and doesn't require continuing monitoring and doesn't set limit values on what those emissions should be.
That, to me, that's what their job should be. It shouldn't be a case of me saying, there's a smell up here, send someone up. When you've got something like that, that is basically a fuel refinery or whatever, for the want of a better word, surely that's something that should be monitored the whole time, as opposed to residents turning around complaining about.
Do you think, perhaps in retrospect, that should have been a requirement of the licence?
Yeah. Look, the licences, you know, a decision was made based on the information that was there at that time, okay? Now.
But in retrospect now.
I think if you were writing the licence now and there was a review of the licence, given the history of the company in the last 6 months of last year, I think we would have factored that information into the actual, into any review process.
The EPA file on the facility contains details of intermittent complaints to the EPA going back to 1998. Other local people we met said they'd complained to Bord Gáis and the Gardaí. Throughout these years, the site operators denied they're the source of any odours locally. Even during the original licence application, there was a complaint received. In 2003, after a series of complaints were received, Enva carried out an odour survey. Over several days, 2 staff from the company periodically checked the local area for odours. They provided their conclusions to the EPA. It said no odours were detected, which were consistent with the activities of their site.
You get nowhere complaining, you know, you do get tired of complaining when nothing's happening. And I mean, you complain, so what, like, what happens? Nothing. It's another next week they'll be there again.
Following my complaint in August, I received no response or acknowledgement from the EPA. I asked them about it yesterday.
In relation to this site, we have documented all of the complaints that we have recorded, and there is a note for every single complaint that came in.
So how did my complaints slip through the net, and was it the only one that slipped through the net?
Yeah, well, Mark, we've had huge contact over the last while, and we've responded, to all of your actual queries. I have tried to find out what happened with your particular complaint. I don't know. There is no record on file.
The number of complaints on file with the EPA is relatively small, averaging 3 per year over the last 10 years. It's not just local residents who have complained. The safety officer at the neighbouring Irish rail plant was onto the EPA too, back in 2007. I am requesting that you investigate the odours emanating from the Enva plant. The staff here complain that it's affecting their throats. As recently as last summer, Irish Rail staff were keeping a log of odours they linked to the Enva site. In fact, odour was concerning enough in 2008 that Enva decided to install an odour treatment system at the site. A spray would be used at the top of the tanks to address what were called possible odours.
I thought that was bizarre, to say the least, that they would try to sort of mask or conceal the odour by introducing a perfume, because the perfume was not going to extract the harmful elements in the vapour emitting from the plant.
Sometimes you will get a perfumed smell coming across. Now, whether that's possible or not, whether they're putting some sort of a mix to kill the smell of the oil or whatever it is. It's like perfume or deodorizer, not a fresh air that type of thing.
Now, I go down the road all the time in the wheelchair, my own wheelchair, like, you know. You get in the breath, you know what I mean? If you're breathing anyway fast at all, you get into the breath, like, you know. And that's when it goes up your nose, like, just goes up your nose.
In 2011, a local resident with a PhD in physics, Dawn Phelan, began investigating.
Sometimes people do get unpleasant odours, but there's nothing to be concerned about. In this case, I was concerned because of, one was the nature of the smell. It was very, very strong. And secondly, because of the nature of the dangerous chemicals that are in waste oil and could be coming out.
He made complaints about the situation to the EPA. Later that year, the EPA sent independent inspectors to investigate the odour. Their report concluded, in the opinion of the inspector, gassy, oily type odours emanating from the Enva site were detected downwind of the facility. The EPA issued a non-compliance notification to Enva saying the odour was a breach of their licence.
I thought maybe there would be some action taken on that, but nothing happened.
Enva disputed the inspector's conclusion. We are not satisfied with the conclusions of the report and in particular strongly dispute the basis on which a formal non-compliance has now been issued. That was January 2012. Come April, the EPA decided to carry out fresh tests on 2 heated tanks. However, there was a problem measuring how fast the air was coming out of them, which threw the results into question. Not alone that, but the temperatures weren't taken. The testing detected no benzene coming from the tanks. What did you make of the 2012 reports? Did they improve on what was known?
Not to a large extent. I mean, in 2012 there was another sample. There's no way that the emissions would have stopped because nothing major has happened to the process in the meantime. So the 2012 measurements and the report on those measurements really doesn't add a great deal to our knowledge or understanding of what's happening.
Internal EPA correspondence shows that EPA staff attempted to approximate the rate of emissions from these new figures. The problem was, one of the instruments used wasn't sensitive enough to measure what it was supposed to measure. They used a figure for the minimum level that instrument could have detected. That figure was then used in a calculation to estimate the overall rate of emissions. Their conclusion was that the tanks would be emitting more than 8 kilograms of these types of hydrocarbons in total an hour during the hours they were heated. This would far exceed, more than 16 times, the short-term emission limits used internationally, which EPA staff compared them against. However, the summary noted those figures were based on an exaggerated flow rate and should therefore be interpreted with caution. Over the 16 years since the EPA first received a licence application for the facility, there have been 7 samples taken. Not one of those 7 samples was successfully and completely done on a tank at more than 50 degrees.
But these models...
Professor Brian Broderick reviewed the emissions data for Primetime.
The emissions of hydrocarbons from the oils that are being recycled is directly proportional to the temperature. It doesn't appear to me that there is a good understanding of what the temperature of the oil is at different times in the process and what the knock-on effect on emissions of hydrocarbons are.
So are you essentially telling me that the EPA doesn't understand fully what's happening in that plant?
Not from the data that I've seen.
The scientists who looked at the testing for us said that it's not representative of the typical operations of this facility, and therefore the emissions that would be coming from it would be unknown to the EPA because they haven't tested the tanks at a typical operating rate.
Mark, we have looked at, and our scientist has looked at different models, but that's one exercise. But we didn't just depend on looking at that. Our scientist has been in contact with the Environment Agency in the UK. They regulate about 10 similar type of facilities. The scientist has looked at 2 of these facilities. And the way we've gone about in terms of investigating this seems to be consistent with what they would do in England.
In June, the EPA published an interim version of a report on the Enva facility. It was compiled in response to concerns raised locally. It reviewed all the data available to date. It contained details of ambient air quality testing done at 2 locations in Portlaoise. It concluded that air quality in the vicinity of the plant and in Portlaoise town is within ambient air quality guideline values. The EPA maintains that view. But do they know what the actual rate of emissions is from the plant?
No, what our scientist has determined using different models is the typical emission rate from the activity. Remember, it's a batch process, okay? And he's made a number of assumptions. We've published in the report that they're conservative estimates, okay? But I said we've gone further. We don't have to rely in terms of emissions. We've measured in terms of the ambient air, and we've been doing so now since September 2014.
We asked the EPA if the ambient air standards are not being breached. Did they find any evidence that the plant was affecting air quality in the area in the short term while the tanks were operating?
We have been monitoring since 2014, and the air quality complies with EU, national and guideline values.
And does this facility have an effect when the tanks are operating? Is there a change to the air quality?
What I'm saying is we have been monitoring since September 2014, and it complies with EU standards.
Is that a yes or a no?
It's complying with EU standards, ambiently.
The report also said odour nuisance was not an ongoing problem. After it was published, locals complained. The EPA sent out inspectors last August. They said there was in fact an odour issue. Some locals say this has been going on for years.
One of the nights here, you could not have stepped outside the door, and they put up this tweet about air quality around Ireland is at whatever percentage it was, and it was based their top mark. And I was just sitting here fuming, going, well, I can't bring my dog out for a walk because I'm not going outside in that.
What they experienced, and we verified in 2015, was disgraceful. And we very quickly, we had the charges went up to September. We were in court 3 months later. And as far as we're concerned, if there is any repeat of that in 2016 or 2017, we will be back in court.
They don't seem to understand what's going on here. They thought I was complaining about a storage tank of oil or something, sitting there. It wasn't. They didn't seem to understand what was going on at the plant.
This is another example of the regulator being asleep at the wheel. We are down to self-regulation, light touch regulation, which isn't in the public interest. It's simply the EPA is not doing its job.
We have done a thorough assessment. We've published the report. And when we got information, and remember it was members of the public came forward to us, we acted very quickly. We had breaches of the licence in September. We were in court in December. Very relatively short space of time.
Enva have now applied to the EPA to install a system which will capture the chemical emissions from the tanks and prevent odours. The EPA is considering the application. Enva say it could take 6 months to install after approval has been given and will cost almost €1 million. They told us, Enva does accept there is potential for odours to be generated on occasion due to its processing of waste oils. Waste is, by its very nature, of variable composition and will vary in its potential to create odour. However, other than odours, Enva is not aware of any air quality monitoring results that have shown any air quality parameter exceeding its relevant guideline value. The court case resulted in a fine of €8,000 for Enva. They have a turnover of approximately €20 million.